Hi, my name is Doug Brown. I'm a retired engineer and an elder in my church, and I will be presenting episode 7 of the Mountainside Apologetics Series, which I've entitled The Flood, Noah's Ark, and Geology. After this point, you won't be seeing my face, you'll be seeing the slides I've prepared, so I invite you to come along with me during this journey. Thank you. So, what do we plan to cover in this presentation? Well, I'd like to answer the following questions. Do we find records of a flood in history, legend, and mythology? Was the biblical flood local or global? Was the ark adequate to carry all the animals? Does the fossil record support a flood? And finally, how could the flood explain the Earth's geological features? Well, I'd like to start by reviewing the basic elements of the biblical story, which is found in Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. In this story, God is very upset, very angry with mankind because mankind is so sinful and the earth is full of violence. So God decided to destroy the earth with a flood. He chose Noah because he was a righteous man and his family to be saved. And so God told Noah to build an ark. He gave specific directions for the size of the ark and how it was to be built. Noah followed God's directions and built the ark as he was instructed, taking some 100 years. And when the ark was completed, 8 people entered the ark, that is Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. And God sent the animals in pairs to the ark. That was probably the biggest miracle in the whole story. The fact that the animals came because God directed them there. God sent the flood, which lasted about a year on the earth, and destroyed everything, killed all the people, all the animals that weren't in the ark, and the flood covered the tops of the highest mountains. Well, the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, which is in eastern Turkey, and when the land was sufficiently dry, Noah and the animals exited the ark. After he left the ark, Noah made a sacrifice to God, thanking him for their salvation. And God, in return, placed the rainbow in the sky and promised never again to destroy the earth with a flood. Now, when we look at flood stories around the world, we find over 300. In fact, one source I read said there were over 500 flood stories worldwide. You can see in the table, which I borrowed from one of my sources, must be 15 to 20 different cultures who each have a flood story recorded, and they're scattered from all over the world, not just in the Middle East, where the biblical story seems to have taken place, but you've got Persia, Syria, Greece, Egypt, Italy, all have flood stories, Lithuania and Russia from Eastern Europe, China in the Far East, India, the Cree civilization in Canada, and the Cherokee Nation in the United States has a flood story. There are a couple of flood stories from some peoples who lived in Mexico, and then a flood story from Peru, stories from the islands, especially one from Hawaii. All these flood stories, I won't say all of them, but many of them have the same elements in them. And you can see the green in the chart, or the partial orange, is either where it matches the Bible completely or partially matches the biblical story. And you can see that the fact that there was destruction by water and humans were saved through this flood and there was universal destruction, those appear in almost every story that's recorded here. So they share a lot of common elements, and there's some striking similarities we'll see with some of the flood stories. Well, is this just a story of local floods from around the world? Or does this point to a catastrophic event that was preserved in legend? And I think logic would lead us to believe that the stories that talk about the universal destruction of the world by water and the salvation of the animals and human beings through that flood, that doesn't sound like just local flood stories of rivers rising here or there. It sounds like there was some event that happened, some catastrophic event that was so significant that every culture preserved some memory of it. And of course, they changed the details as time passed. But how could they have shared the stories with one another when we're looking at cultures from all over the world? Well, there's a few flood stories I find especially interesting. In Egyptian mythology, It features the Ogdode, which I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it means the eight. And these stories appear in the earliest Egyptian tombs and writing. They had a leader named Nu, sounds a bit like Noah, right? Along with 3 other males and the consort. So there are 8 people, 4 males and 4 females. They're pictured in the Egyptian tombs and pictures as divinities holding up the sky. The Hawaiian legend tells of a man named Nu'u, who built a large canoe and took all the animals on it, and only the people and animals in the canoe survived. Our Chinese legend tells of a man named Nuwa, who turned back a great flood in a boat and then repopulated the earth. Ancient Chinese characters used for writing show an ark housing 8 worshippers. So, sounds very much like the Noah flood story. Of all the flood stories I've seen, the biblical record seems to be the most believable by far. Building a large canoe, well, how's a canoe going to take all the animals on it? And one of the flood stories from the Middle East, I think, has a coracle, a round boat, which would be a very unstable boat for a large number of people and animals. One of the flood stories talks about a raft. Well, raft is not really a logical way to save all the animals either. So it would seem that the true flood story was adapted by various cultures, and if there was a boat, they included a boat of the type of boat that they knew, that they used. But that didn't go all the way back to the design in the Bible of the ark. But it is interesting that all of these people, even with names that seem similar to Noah, have been preserved in legend from around the world. Well, was the flood local or global? I have some friends, Christians, believers in the Bible, who are convinced the flood was local, but I disagree strongly with them because I think the Bible is describing a global flood. Just look at the words here that come directly out of Genesis chapter 7, verses 19 through 23, and note all of the superlative terms, all, every, things like that. So he says, in the Bible, the waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits, which would be 23 feet, I think. Every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. Now, if you were trying to describe a global flood, a catastrophe that wiped out everything on the earth, how would you explain it in words any more explicit than the ones here? It seems pretty clear the Bible's trying to tell us about a global flood. Now, the New Testament does speak of the flood too. Jesus spoke of the flood as a real event. In the book of Luke, he said, just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. And the Apostle Peter spoke of the flood as a real event too. He said in his epistle, 2 Peter, if he, that is God, did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, if this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. So we have the New Testament attesting to the truth of the flood and the universal destruction that accompanied the flood. Finally, there's much evidence in the Bible. If you look at the story against a local flood, that is, if the flood was purely local, why did God bother Noah with building an ark? I mean, in 100 years, couldn't Noah have immigrated to a part of the earth that would not be covered by the flood? Why did God send every kind of animal to the ark? Wouldn't the animals, most of them, been scattered around the earth and been preserved? Why was the ark big enough to hold all kinds of animals? You wouldn't need a big ark in that case. Why would birds have been sent on board? After all, birds can fly. If it was just a local flood, they could have flown across to another mountain in the distance and gotten away from it. How could the waters cover local mountains and leave the rest of the world untouched? Obviously, if even the flood were covering low mountains, say, like the 5,000-foot mountains back in the eastern U.S., that's a lot of water. 5,000 feet is going to cover a lot of the earth. A local flood in Mesopotamia, as some have suggested, doesn't really fit the geography of the area. And local floodwaters don't last for 150 days at their height and then take another 220 days to dry out. We have some pretty big floods in various parts of the world, but they last for a matter of days. The waters go right back down. And all people wouldn't have been wiped out had it been a local flood. And finally, why would God promise never to send such a flood again? God has allowed local floods pretty much every year in various parts of the world. So God would have been lying if he said there wouldn't be another such flood. But if the flood were universal, well, we know there hasn't been another such flood. Is the biblical story of the ark reasonable? Well, let's look at the huge size, 450 feet long by 75 feet wide by 45 feet high. And that's the smaller cubit. There were different sizes of cubits, so it could have been a little bigger than that. This explains to me why it took Noah and his sons close to 100 years to build the ark. The proportions of the ark are the same as for military and commercial seagoing vessels, 6 times longer than it is wide, and that's been determined to be the right proportions that will help a ship ride through rough seas, which we're assuming there were some rough seas during the flood. The covering with about a 1 cubit or 1.5 foot opening at the top would allow them to have air circulation, but would prevent big waves from swamping the vessel and filling it up. The 3 decks that God told them to build would give them sufficient room for all the cages and supplies and for Noah's family. There was no propulsion system because no propulsion system was needed. All they needed was an ark that could ride out the storm. And finally, God even told them what to build it out of. Some versions say gopher wood, others say cypress wood, but he was specific about getting a wood that could be worked on for 100 years and wouldn't rot. My wife and I went to see the Ark Encounter a few years ago. It's located in northern Kentucky, about 30 to 40 miles south of Cincinnati. It was built there by the organization called Answers in Genesis, and I've used some information from them in this presentation. They also have a creation museum there in the suburbs of Cincinnati. I really recommend that if you ever get a chance to go back there. Of course, the Ark Encounter was built for tourists, and so the interior was laid out with very wide walkways to accommodate large crowds. But even so, they did equip it with quite a few cages, food storage containers, and living quarters for Noah and his family, so you could see how it could be outfitted. And without the big wide walkways, they could have gotten a lot more cages in the ark than they did in this particular case. Very, very interesting and very impressive. Just look at the size of this thing. The people up there close to the ark look just about like ants in this picture. But these are pictures I took myself while we were there visiting. So you can see the gigantic size of the ark according to the biblical dimensions. Well, the ark did have plenty of room for lots of animals and for food and supplies. You can see in the picture on the left, they gave a layout of all 3 decks of the ark and how those could be laid out with cages and storage containers. They say there were 1,398 animal kinds, 6,700 animals. So this is worth talking about a little bit, animal kinds. So when the Bible in Genesis 1 talks about creation, it says that he created all of the animals according to their kind. And that's not the word species, that's something that we have invented later on. But if you think about it, and these guys in these organizations have thought about it a lot, you can narrow down the number of animals so that you could have basically one feline kind. All the animals in the cat family are very similar. They all have much the same features, and they can, in fact, reproduce with one another. Lions and tigers can produce offspring. And so it's not unreasonable to think that God created these different kinds of animals with enough genetic diversity so that they could adapt and diversify. And so maybe one canine type, wolves and foxes and dogs. We know for a fact that you can take a couple of just generic mongrel dogs and you can breed just about every kind of dog known to man from those. So they do have lots of genetic material in that dog kind. So by assuming that the animals were grouped according to kinds, which is like a genus or a family or something, you can easily fit all the animals in there. And that includes, by the way, dinosaurs. They allowed for all the types of dinosaurs to be on the ark because if God told Noah to take all the animals, that would have logically included dinosaurs. So I've got pictures on the right, a cage of the cattle kind, as they call it, the sacks of grain stored up there in the upper left picture, small cages with water bottles attached to them, other water or liquid containers. So there was room for a lot of food and provisions as well as a huge number of animals in this ark. So now we ask, what caused the flood? Well, the Bible mentions two water sources in it. It mentions water coming out of the springs of the deep, which would have been the ocean, the depths of the ocean, and rain. Now, I did read in the last few years some scientific research has determined that the amount of water bound up in the rocks of the Earth's mantle is much greater than the amount of water in the oceans. In other words, there's a lot of water down there in the oceans, and on top of that, even more water bound up in the mantle of the Earth. So there's no lack of water to bring about a flood. And if there was, in fact, all the activity we think of, volcanic activity and such, the oceans would have been warmed, they would have had lots of water vapor and produced a lot of rain. Well, we know that there is plenty of water in the oceans right now to cover the whole Earth. In fact, I've seen a couple of calculations that say if all of the land, the mountains, the seafloor, and everything were brought to the same level, that the Earth would be covered with 1.6 or 1.7 miles of water. So, if we've got that much water on this Earth, a much smaller rise in the ocean floor and a smaller drop in the mountains would result in all the land being covered by water. In fact, most creationists, and I fall in this category, believe that catastrophic plate tectonics accounted for the flood. That is, the Earth's plates could have suddenly started moving, shifting up and down, and all that had to happen was the tectonic plates underneath the sea needed to rise some, and the ones on the land needed to drop a little. That, of course, when you start moving around these huge tectonic plates, you're going to have earthquakes. In fact, that's what happens when a couple of tectonic plates out there along the coast of California shift. That's exactly what causes the earthquakes. And when there's an earthquake, like they had in Japan, that will cause quite often a tsunami, as it causes a big violent action on the seafloor and causes a wave to ripple across the entire ocean. Well, if the tectonic plates are breaking apart, shifting, you know there's going to be volcanic activity and magma is going to be coming to the surface. So all of those things could have been happening and would have accounted for a lot of the things that we see as a result of the flood. So I wanted to point out that the Earth was once a single landmass. The Bible implies that in Genesis 1 in the creation story, but secular geologists have long believed that there was an original supercontinent. They've given it the name Pangaea, and it was pointed out when I was a kid in school 50, 60 years ago. People pointed out that the continents, if you cut them apart on a map and you could fit them together, and they fit together pretty well, and I could tell that. We've got here a picture I've taken of what people believe the supercontinent Pangaea looked like. And I got the version that showed the various nations of the world, so you can see that and relate it to what you see now. But you can see how the United States fits right up against the west coast of Africa. Brazil and South America fits up in there by the United States and up against Africa. Makes pretty much a perfect match. India and Saudi Arabia would fit against Africa, and Antarctica as well, and Australia. Well, it turns out It's not just cutting and pasting pictures off the map that shows that all the land was most likely part of a supercontinent, but when they have tested rock layers, they find that the rocks and the layers of rock on one side of the ocean match almost perfectly the rocks across in another continent. And it's pretty much makes it clear that those rocks were all part of one formation and they just broke apart at some point. But that could very easily explain the flood. Now, of course, secular geologists generally believe that this supercontinent split apart very slowly, inches per year, over millions of years, but that's not necessarily the case. And in fact, if there was an event as described, the biblical flood is described in the Bible, that would have accounted for very quick breakup of the continents and very quick motion. And in fact, the only way one would likely be able to survive that is on the water, because the water absorbs the shock. Otherwise, you'd have such tremendous destruction on the earth that people couldn't have survived. So, the fossil record supports the existence of a worldwide flood. We've got lots of fossils and lots of information right here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Sandia Peak, just a few miles away. Most people who live here at one time or another go up to the top of Sandia Peak, and there's a layer of limestone on top of the mountain, and the limestone contains fossils of little sea creatures on it. They've found limestone and fossils of sea creatures on top of Mount Everest and all kinds of mountains. I can't list them all. In fact, you can sit here in Albuquerque and look along the top of the Sandia Mountains and you see this little white layer up along the top. That's the limestone. Well, if limestone is formed at the bottom of oceans, then doesn't that indicate that these mountains were once covered by water at the bottom of an ocean? We have things like a fossil of an ichthyosaur, which is kind of like a primitive reptilian dolphin-like animal, but a fossil of this ichthyosaur giving birth. Well, why would you have an ichthyosaur just dying and creating a fossil and giving birth if there wasn't some catastrophic event that killed it and buried it to produce a fossil? We found fossils of giant jellyfish, hundreds of them, in a Wisconsin quarry. And there are dinosaur graveyards scattered around the earth with hundreds of fossils in each one. There are graveyards in Montana. There's been some interesting research done digging up the fossils there. Alberta, Canada, Utah, Mongolia, Australia, Spain, all around the earth. Not just in a single place, but scattered around the earth are these dinosaur graveyards. Now, people talk about fossils. I don't have a slide on this, but in some of the books on evolution, it talks about how fish die and their carcass falls to the bottom of the ocean and it gets covered up and it becomes a fossil, which is kind of ludicrous for people that know much about fish, because when fish die, what do? They float, they rot, they get eaten by scavengers. And the same thing, dinosaurs are dying. What's going to happen when a dinosaur dies? Well, probably a dozen other dinosaurs will show up and start eating the dinosaur. You're not going to have the dinosaur left there to fossilize. He's going to be consumed. But the fact that there were so many graveyards of these various kinds of creatures suggests that they were buried quickly. So what does it take to create a fossil? Really, it only takes two things. One is rapid burial. The body of the organism has to be buried quickly to keep it from decomposing or from being eaten by scavengers, which is what normally happens when animals die. Dead fish don't sink to the bottom, they float, and they're eaten by scavengers or decompose. So it takes rapid burial, and it takes a water solution containing the right minerals, because these minerals need to replace the plant and animal tissue in order to form a fossil. It does not take a lot of time. A little time is all that's required to form fossils. We know that. There are documented cases of fossils being formed in months or years. I have seen the evidence from a fossilized man's hat, fossilized teddy bears, a fossilized roll of fence wire, and we know none of those were millions of years old. So it really doesn't take that much time in the right conditions. And any kind of plant or animal can be fossilized. Darwin himself said it would be difficult for an organism formed wholly of soft tissue to be preserved. Well, he's right, but we find hundreds of jellyfish fossils in a Wisconsin quarry. So if the jellyfish are buried quickly so they can't decompose, they can be fossilized. Well, there's a dinosaur stampede. There are actually dinosaur stampedes in a number of places. By a stampede, they discern that from the fact that there are large numbers of dinosaur tracks going in the same direction and apparently running. Running from something, a predator, or running from a flood. Well, I think a lot of scientists who don't believe in a flood would say, there's just a tyrannosaur was after them and they're all running away. But we have lots of these made in different parts of the earth. And by the way, if a predator is running after a herd of animals, what do the animals typically do? Do they stay together in a pack and run straight ahead? I would think that normally the animals start scattering in every direction. That way the predator can't catch all of them, he can only catch one. So the fact that there are these tracks running together would be more indicative of trying to escape a flood than it would be trying to escape a predator. We sometimes find tracks of different types of dinosaurs. They're probably more concerned with getting away from the flood than they are about eating one another. And there are some tracks, especially in Australia, they found tracks that appear to be made by partially floating dinosaurs. That is, some of the tracks are full tracks, deep in the mud. Some just kind of scratch the surface of the earth. Some just poke straight down and pop back out like somebody's trying to jump through the mud. And there's a case in Australia where they could see the direction of the current from the ripples in the sand, and the dinosaurs seem to be going against some kind of current. So you might suspect that dinosaurs are trying to get to the high ground. The water is running toward them, and they're fighting the current to get to the higher ground. That'd be a very natural thing for any living thing to do. So they found these dinosaur track beds in Australia, Bolivia, Utah, and around the world. Well, they also find many dinosaurs that seem to obviously have been buried alive. There's a classic posture called the classic death throes posture. And they find so many dinosaur fossils in this posture where the neck is thrown back, the tail is extended, the hind legs are drawn up. In fact, a writer for the New Scientist magazine made the comment, there are too many, in fact, to be a coincidence. Well, I don't believe it was a coincidence. I believe the dinosaurs were being buried alive, and this is their reaction to it. Well, let's look at how the flood can explain many geological features of our Earth. And we'll talk about each of these in more detail, but the fact that sedimentary rock covers about 75% of the Earth. Planar, the smooth, flat surfaces like our mesas here in New Mexico, can be explained by the flood. Water gaps, the Grand Canyon itself, folded rock layers, and polystrate fossils can all be explained readily by the flood. Well, let's look at this little diagram, an artist's conception of how the flood may have proceeded. Well, the question is, where did all the flood water go? That's why I don't believe the flood was created just by rain, because where did all that water go? I think it was mainly the movement of tectonic plates that accounts for that. But when the flood had reached its peak and the land started to rise again, the flood water's got to go somewhere. And so at first, the flood water would have flowed in large sheets. And that can create the smooth planation surfaces like mesas that we see, where the ground is extremely flat and smooth. Well, as the water level dropped, it would have started to carve channels, even across the mountains and highlands. So we see in picture B to the left that we have water flowing across the mountains, but it started to gouge a channel through the mountains. And then as the water level drops, then we have mountain peaks starting to show, and the water still is channeling through there, through the mountains. And finally, as the water runs completely off, all that's left is a river. And that's why we find, I think, a number of cases where rivers just seem to penetrate right through the middle of the mountains. And you ask, how did it manage to choose this path versus taking an easier route and going around the mountains in the first place? So the Grand Canyon is one great example. We can ask, why did the Colorado River run across these highlands of northern Arizona and southern Utah? Why did it go that way rather than around the highlands? And why are the edges so sharp with sheer cliffs if they've been eroding for millions of years? There's not a lot of evidence of erosion along the Grand Canyon. I was paying attention to this in my trip just 2 or 3 years ago because I had read about this in some creation magazine. And sure enough, as I got there and was looking very carefully, yeah, the edges are very sharp and don't have a lot of evidence of erosion that one would have expected over such a long period of time. In fact, the Havasupai Indians who live in the Grand Canyon and in that area have a legend of a flood that covered the earth and created the canyon as the waters fell. And according to their legend, a god put a woman in a hollowed out log and she escaped, rode through this flood. Well, sounds like another flood story that's similar in concept to the story of Noah. Well, we got the Grand Canyon going right through the middle of these highlands. We got layers of rock in the Grand Canyon that are very neat and clean. Now, we've got the layer of hermit shale, the kind of dark reddish colored rock there on the right, upper right. And then we have above it the layer of coconino sandstone. Now, according to geological conventional wisdom, the coconino sandstone was deposited 12 million years after the hermit shale. And yet, look at the line, the fine line between these two layers. If the shale, which is fairly soft, had been deposited 12 million years earlier, wouldn't you expect there to be some erosion there of the shale and the line between them to be rather irregular? That's what I would expect. Yeah, why is there more erosion there? Well, perhaps it hasn't been millions of years since those layers were laid down, and in fact, the coconino sandstone could have been deposited immediately on top of the hermit shale during this flood. So now we've got folded rock layers, which we have to explain. Have you ever tried bending a rock? They don't bend very easily. In fact, if you put enough force on a rock to try to bend it, you're just going to break it and you're going to have fragmented rock. But these rock layers must have been soft when they were folded. One is a folded limestone layer in the Andes of Peru, and you can see the dash line shows you where the limestone layer goes. Limestone would have been laid down at the bottom of the sea, probably during the flood, and then almost immediately the ground must have pushed up while the layer of rock was still soft and wet and bent it into this curved shape because it's not broken up. Again, you see the layer from Australia where it makes an S-curve. How did the rock get bent into that shape if it was already hard when that happened? So it must have been folded when it was soft. And we have polystrate fossils, these tree trunks that they found in layers of sedimentary rock. Well, normally geologists would say, well, that sedimentary rock formed over millions of years, but that wouldn't have been the case here because if the bottom of the tree is encased in sedimentary rock and the top is still not fossilized, it would rot out pretty quickly. So the rock layer must have formed around the trees all at one time, and it must have been a catastrophic event because some of the fossilized logs are turned upside down. So it wasn't just a matter of sediment settling around a bunch of trees that are sitting in a forest. The trees must have been ripped up and turned around and encased in sediment. And we'll see in a few slides how that could have happened. And that has to do with Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is a great example because we had such technology that there were cameras that were watching the event in real time and people were there watching it. So we know exactly what happened and we know how quickly it happened. There were things that happened during the Mount St. Helens eruption in a matter of hours or days that geologists thought took millions of years. And the mountain ecosystem even recovered more quickly than expected. My wife and I visited, probably 15 or 20 years ago. It was already recovering from the eruption and vegetation and animals were starting to move back onto the mountain. Well, one thing that happened during the eruption was there was a canyon, 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon, that was formed in a single day. Well, that says the Grand Canyon didn't have to take millions of years to form, did it? Maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. Now, another thing that happened at Mount St. Helens was with the eruption, 1 million trees were ripped out of the ground and washed into Spirit Lake. And at that point in time, there was a raft of logs that covered the lake so completely that you could hardly see the water, they say. Eventually, tree trunks became waterlogged and started to float vertically. And then, as they turned vertical, their roots became encased in sediment. So, as I was talking about those polystrate fossils, you can get those from a situation like this, where the tree trunks are washed into the water, become waterlogged, and the sediment flows in around them. It doesn't take millions of years to produce those. Another thing we learned from Mount St. Helens is that those fine laminations that show in the picture there, where the canyon was formed by water and mudslides, the laminations are normally associated with a deposition over millions of years, and yet they know how long this took. It was a matter of hours for this to happen. So with the right kind of catastrophic event, you can have some of these things that we see in geology occurring very quickly. So the question you have to ask yourself is, was there a universal flood? Well, I believe the flood stories from around the world point to a universal flood. I believe the fossil record supports it, and the geological evidence we've just looked at supports it. I believe the survival of Noah and his family and the animals was feasible given the size of the ark and the design of the ark. They could have very easily ridden out something as catastrophic as this global flood and survived. So this evidence you've seen does not provide conclusive proof of a global flood. If someone wants to come up with another story to explain it, they can and undoubtedly will, but I believe this provides powerful evidence for anyone who's willing to look at it objectively. So the question is, what will you do with the evidence? I want to read a quote from the Apostle Peter from 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 7, where Peter says, "Above all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, 'Where is this coming he promised?' Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. By the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly." Well, he says, people will come scoffing, and they'll say, everything's been going on just as it has since the beginning, but it hasn't been going on the same. There was a big interruption. If you look at the evidence, there was a huge flood that destroyed the earth, deluged it at one point in time, and God made a promise that he will destroy the earth again in the future, in his time. So the question is, will you take this story to heart? Will you look at the evidence and believe it, or will you dismiss it? I was doing searches on the internet, and I had one pop up, and it sounded interesting. I figured it wasn't a Christian, but I thought, well, I ought to hear what this person has to say about the flood. And I started listening to it, the little video. And the thing that struck me about it was the tone of the person making the video was just really flippant. And it wasn't serious. And instead of really looking at any evidence, he was just poking fun at the thought of a flood and reading stories of some of the other flood stories, like the Gilgamesh epic, which I take as evidence that there really was a flood. But he was just saying, oh, there's a lot of flood stories, and this is just another flood story, and no big deal. Well, some people will take that attitude, but I encourage you to really look at this evidence and see if it doesn't point toward the truth of the biblical story of the flood and Noah's Ark, and take it to heart. So these are some further sources of information. My favorite sources are creation.com and answersingenesis.org. Answers in Genesis is the organization that built the life-size replica of Noah's Ark there in northern Kentucky. You can get a lot of information from there. I've only hit the highlights. You could spend days, weeks, maybe months reading about this if you're interested. But I've tried to present enough information so that you can see that the biblical story of Noah's Ark holds water, pun intended, and you can see that there's enough evidence to point to the truth of that story. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Mountainside Apologetics Series. I hope you found it half as interesting as I do to look at evidence for the global flood, for Noah's Ark, and the stories and how they might explain things we see here on the earth today. I invite you to come back and join us in the next episode of the Mountainside Apologetics Series, where Evan Bensicle or I will be talking about the Bible, its historicity, and archaeological evidence to support it. Thank you.